The Quo Podcast. Change your way.
Welcome to the Quo Podcast. I'm Ali. In this episode, I'll be interviewing Elson Price. Elson is an established Australian double bassist and composer based in Sydney who has performed as a featured artist both locally and internationally. In 2019, Elson sustained a serious spinal injury that required an extended period of recovery. For a significant part of his rehab, he was unable to play the double bass, which negatively impacted upon both his mental health and livelihood. His own experiences have led him to shed a light on the exploitation of musicians and become an advocate for the development of structures that better protect their mental health. I'd like to launch straight into why I invited you on the podcast. You sent me a really powerful article entitled, "Do we have to wait 10 years for mental health discrimination to be taken seriously?" I found your personal story really moving, so I guess I'd just like to know what inspired you to start thinking really seriously about this question?
It's an interesting question because I think there's different elements to it. There's, I guess, the subject of mental health and mental health discrimination. And I guess there's a realization of positive change over a 10-year period. And those two things were, quite unfortunate circumstances. I, found myself needing to find that out. But I think both have been quite positive in learning that and understanding what could happen, or what can happen, or what should happen, or various other things like that. Because we've just come out of a COVID period, and a part of that time was looking at a lot of promotion for mental health awareness for musicians, because I lost, I think, close to $30,000 within that period through loss of gigs and all that sort of stuff. And, around the world, people have lost, quite a lot of money for what they're doing. And what was quite common during that period was a lot of awareness pushing the mental health of musicians. There was, of course, a Support Act, a wonderful initiative put to supporting musicians during that time, and various other initiatives like Beyond Blue were specifically targeting the entertainment industry because they took such a large toll. But previous to that, I did find myself in a fairly severe situation of discrimination for mental health illness. And I guess during that COVID period time, I was quite proactive in finding out more about how, I guess, those processes work beyond myself, because I was quite lucky. I did find myself quite a lot of support during that time. And I guess with that support and actually finding myself supported and actually able to get myself out of that situation, I started thinking a little bit broader about other people who might be in that situation as well. And it sort of got me thinking that, with this awareness for mental health, specifically from the arts perspective, I'm seeing this as possibly, is this the start of that 10-year period? Is this the start of that 10-year period where we're getting awareness of something which at the moment there is quite a lot of need for change? But I'm questioning is, why should that take 10 years or so?
You're an accomplished professional double bassist and you're a composer. I'd love to have a little bit of insight into your career before 2018 when you're affected by a serious spinal injury.
I think music is a very rewarding career because you only do that sort of thing if you enjoy it. And if you're doing something you enjoy, then it's pretty great. I had a wonderful friend who said, it's a pretty great job because we judge each performance by how much we enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's not true for many careers.
Not many people go to work and judge the situation about how much fun they had. It's sort of it's a part of that, I guess, that artistic creative world where your own enjoyment is something that elevates the situation. When you're enjoying something, you know that other people will, and you know that it's going to be working in one way or another. And it has been, I think, a very wonderful time. With this sort of job, you meet lots and lots of interesting people and do lots of very interesting things with different people. And it was an interesting time till 2018, where I found myself doing a tour around Australia and did, unfortunately, do some serious injury to my back, spine more specifically. And what was a journey to the emergency room ended up being a 4-month sort of homebound recovery, which, you know, it happens to people. No, not necessarily in this job. I know other jobs where this sort of thing is a little bit more common.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess the support from my immediate network was quite positive. You know, everyone sort of understood the situation and all that sort of thing, but did find myself in a very bizarre circumstance where a person did essentially penalise that illness, or that what did happen was a spine injury and me not being able to work during that period. And that was the first time I'd really experienced that sort of penalisation. And I think I've been very lucky in working for such a long time, so since 2008 till 2018, so a 10-year period, where I hadn't been put in that situation where I've been sent a big angry letter sort of saying you need to pay this much because you haven't done this and blah, 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 till finally finding the necessary support to actually, you know, sort of defend myself and get myself out of that situation. On the side of that, when people find themselves in these situations, what I did develop what was described as a fairly severe adjustment disorder, where I was essentially having to change my lifestyle in a way in which affected the way my stress levels were. People find these situations extraordinarily stressful, you know, when people are bedbound, even during the COVID period. I mean,
There's been huge mental health repercussions.
Yeah.
So that must have been really intensified for you after what seems like something that was significantly changing your ability to work, potentially your financial situation and your quality of life. So can you talk a little bit more about that period where you had the injury and then developed the adjustment disorder? What were the kind of symptoms you were experiencing? What was your day-to-day and how was it affecting your work?
When you haven't experienced something before, you obviously don't understand it until you do. And I think when I was in that situation of being homebound and recovering from this thing, you know, I did sort of treat the situation, I'm fine, I'll get better and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, I probably wasn't very honest with how stressed I was getting about the financial aspect, about the just, you know, can I perform again? I perform on a very, very large instrument, and that does require, you know, being physically
strong
able to move.
Yes.
In that sort of way. And one of the possibilities of what had happened to my spine was possibly, you know, using my legs and all that sort of stuff, which, you know, was quite confronting. But, you know, I was lucky enough to get it all sorted and did heal sort of relatively well. I do still have some nerve damage, but, you know, I'm walking, so I'm quite happy and I can still perform. But those sorts of small stresses do add up. It's great that I do have the capacity as a musician to actually create work, because I know it can be a very difficult thing to do in this part of the world. Live music is extraordinarily limited here for various reasons. But that element of stress did sort of skyrocket in a really bizarre way, in that, you know, what started off as essentially nervous coughing every morning, you know, I thought, okay, I've got something sort of wrong with my throat or something, until finally it started getting quite extended and deliberate, sort of whenever there was a stressful situation, started coughing and all that sort of stuff. It's a point where I was starting to cough and suddenly there was blood coming out, and, you know,
that's scary.
Starting to get a bit bizarre, till finally starting to get quite dizzy, sort of different parts of the day, till finally, I think, so 2 or 3 months after this time, so sort of in the thick of, you know, trying to sort out, am I supposed to be paying a few $1,000s to someone who was trying to have a go at me, to actually blacking out.
I would have thought that the people you're working with, your co-collaborators and fellow musicians would be quite empathic and understanding of what you were going through, but it seems like that sometimes wasn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, it was an odd situation, because during the recovery from the spine surgery, it was, because that sort of surgery, it can have a week recovery. And that was the best case scenario. That's what I was told. I was like, okay, you'll be fine in a week, but, you know, which didn't happen over 4 months or so. So when people were calling me, oh, are you available to do this? Are you available to do this? And I'm like, yeah, sure, I should be fine by then. But then the week later, calling them again saying, sorry, I actually won't be fine then. I'm sorry, I can't do that. And it was sort of this cat and mouse situation of sort of getting asked to do things which I'd say yes to, then suddenly say no to, which I'm very lucky to obviously get offered things regularly like that, but obviously the it was an interesting time for other people who I was working with, who were trying to get me involved with things where I wasn't involved with and all that sort of thing. Till finally, I went and saw my GP about, why would I just suddenly be blacking out and getting dizzy, and he sort of said, it sounds like you got some sort of adjustment disorder, you should probably go and see a specialist and all that sort of thing. And it was right. Like, I sort of just essentially had a severe amount of stress, and the triggers for that were quite small. If I was driving along and someone cut me off in the road, I'll probably start coughing and start almost choking myself while I'm trying to
Oh my God,
drive,
scary.
which was which was pretty confronting. But I was quite lucky in that I did access quite a good specialist who sort of worked me through a means of getting around that. Didn't need to get medication or anything sort of extended like that. It was just obviously recognising what was going on.
Was it a talk therapy approach that he suggested? Was it a mindfulness approach, or what kind of strategy did you find effective for overcoming or managing those symptoms?
I found a specialist who understood the way the brain's chemicals respond in different situations. And I'd obviously just gotten used to just being stressed out all the time, and there are physiological ways you can actually change the way your brain chemistry works, which was really quite good. So, just the combination of breathing exercises and whatnot, and especially recognising the times that you need to do that. And at that time, I think I was doing breathing exercises 24/7, just to sort of accommodate
just to
it,
regulate.
which was great, because every time I'm finding myself in a stressful situation now, I just sort of, which is pretty incredible. But that wasn't a quick fix. Like, that was a slow and progressive fix. And when you are in a place where every stressful situation is making you into a fit of coughs, or blacking out or getting dizzy or whatnot, you really can't be performing. What was prescribed is you need to take time off. The idea that I was working twice as much as I was beforehand to make up for the losses, or the financial losses I had during that 4-month period, was probably the worst thing I could have been doing. So I had to work less, which was bit, counterintuitive to wanting to sort of get finance.
Make up on lost time.
Yeah, but health was priority, so, sort of brought things back and stopped performing for, maybe a few months or so. Didn't really sort of declare anything or anything like that. I just sort of didn't accept gigs for a certain amount of period, which fixed all that. But unfortunately, with that process, I did talk to one performer and said that, this is what happened, I can't perform. And the reaction was that similar to the reaction of the person who tried to penalise me for the spine thing, which was really quite bizarre. It was bizarre how it sort of escalated. And it was a very odd situation. I think just with, what we were talking about at the start about, I guess, this understanding of mental illness and acceptance of that and wanting to support that, it was very much a counter of that.
So people are often talking about mental health awareness for musicians, but your experience, at least with this person, was that there was no acknowledgement that your mental health issue needed to be taken seriously and respected, and you weren't treated with the kind of understanding that you would have expected.
It was very odd. And I think, every experience is different in its own. And I think the contrast of this situation, I think the big part for me personally was I'd never really experienced anything like this over, a 12-year career of performing. Like, I think the closest I've ever come to is probably typical to any self-employed person, is someone not paying or having to chase someone for money or little things like that, which is a part of the job. But with me sort of saying I couldn't actually perform, it was interesting because I'd had a meeting with this person and it had all been done and it was all done and all that sort of stuff. And then later on I'd realised I hadn't been paid for a few performances I'd done beforehand, and to my knowledge it was all on good terms that, I couldn't perform, and my priorities were my own health and obviously other personal things and all that sort of stuff. And the response was, I'm not going to pay you because what you've done is very unprofessional and yada yada yada.
That is very bizarre, especially if on the surface that person seemed to be quite understanding. It was almost paying lip service to what they felt needed to be said, but their actions spoke to a kind of lack of understanding of the seriousness of your condition.
Yeah, and it was odd because this person doesn't present themselves as the typical person to take advantage of that sort of situation. They don't sort of look as someone who would sort of be a bit of a predator within that situation. And my response was, okay, like that's a bit odd. Look, can I please be paid for what I've done? And they came up with various reasons why they couldn't pay, and it was a bizarre situation, but it sort of got a little bit further when suddenly I'd found other people within my network had actually been contacted specifically by this person where I'd been described as unprofessional, I've been acting really awful about this for whatever reason. And that's when things started to get a little bit odd. It's like suddenly people are being contacted about something which I thought was a fairly small matter and sort of escalated upon until finally, it was essentially defamation. When you're contacting people specifically within a person's network to try and till finally
spread negative information, and false information.
Yeah, and so that essentially turned into a demanding, can I please be paid and can you please stop sort of doing this, till finally actually being threatened.
Are you talking about verbal, a written threat or verbal threat?
So threatened in a sense of, if you tell anyone about what I've done, this is what I'll do to you, type thing.
Wow.
Which
That's
was
very disturbing.
Yeah, which was pretty dark. And then it just sort of, I ended up getting paid, so I was happy about that. But it did put things in perspective. I mean, is it something worth pursuing, or is the core element of it something worth addressing? And it was interesting that COVID happened after this period, and it was that time again where I wasn't working for a lengthy period of time. And it was interesting coming from 4 months of no performance during the spine surgery to suddenly COVID no performance for, I think it was 5 or 6 months, where I wasn't really worried about COVID terribly, because there's ways and means of supporting yourself without performance as an artist. And after I had my spine surgery, I sort of doubled up on teaching and students and all that sort of stuff, and that supported me straight through COVID. So it was almost a blessing that I'd already worked that stuff out beforehand before going into COVID. But during that time, I think all artists that I've talked to, it was a fairly reflective time, I think, creatively. A lot of artists spend a lot of time writing new music or practicing their own or developing sort of new projects and all that sort of stuff. And my pursuit was looking into, if this is what's happened to me, what's happened to other people.
And what did you find when you asked other musicians about, have they had similar experiences to you? Have they been the victim of mental health discrimination within the industry?
What I did find was being open about my own experiences did get other musicians to be more open about their own experiences. So, people who've had various threats of different ways, financial issues, discrimination in all shapes and sizes. It was very confronting, I think, hearing this from people who are in a close network to you. And it sort of became quite obvious that people didn't feel comfortable about talking about these sorts of issues within music, because music in this part of the world is an extraordinarily difficult occupation. There's various laws that limit live performance here. There's not many places to work as an artist. And I think the platforms that artists have to work in are very limited. What I'm sort of saying is, a lot of artists are very thankful for the little that they get.
And I would assume that would mean that they would accept poor conditions as a result, because someone else could just come and replace them, given how competitive it is here.
Yeah. I mean, competitive is an interesting word, because, it's hard to be competitive when there is limited resources. I think competitive in the genuine sense. Like, I do like the idea that music is competitive in a creative sense, where people do like to, build themselves and sort of, really
Competing against yourself and your previous performance
Yeah.
as opposed to other people.
Yeah,
Is that
well-
what you're saying?
Well, competing on a level playing field. I think that's a big part of art, is when people can compete on a level playing field, wonderful things can happen. Whereas if things are very limited and very pigeonholed, and only availabilities are made for certain reasons and for, certain financial support or all that sort of thing, suddenly it's no longer a competitive area.
Leading on from that, what do you think needs to change from, I guess, a tangible change perspective and a cultural change perspective to make the industry a safer place for people who might be facing mental health issues?
Yeah, what happened during COVID was I did start pursuing within my own networks, I guess, musicians' perspectives on the issues that they've faced, and I got to the point where I actually ended up joining a political party. And looking
What
into,
political party?
The Arts Party.
Oh, awesome.
And looking at what can be done, I think, from a government level for the support of artists, because it is an under-supported area, especially by, I think, governments for the last at least 20 years or so. There's been a severe lack in support for the arts, and what that has meant has been this creation of this unfair environment for performance, and just that lack of healthy competition as opposed to, healthy competition within that area. And
So what do you think, from your involvement in the Arts Party, governments can do to better, I guess, beyond funding, improve the industry so that it is more level playing field kind of competition as opposed to what it currently is?
I think from a government perspective, there is a lot of laws that conflict with the idea of live music here. There's, from a local council level, getting live music permits and all that sort of stuff is quite difficult. The rents on venues is extremely high. I think over the last 10 years there's been, I don't know how many venues that have closed. So actually running a venue is almost impossible now. With the live music scene or a live music industry, having as many venues as possible does create this idea of a healthy competitive environment where everyone has the opportunity to perform as much as they can, and therefore things happen as they need to. That's something that could easily be done by the government, initiatives to create more live music and more opportunities for live music. Regulations on, I think, the conditions for musicians is the standard. I mean, with what I've experienced and by what I've heard other people experience, there is a lot of things that aren't being talked about within the industry. And I think there's a lot of things from a government level, like essentially just making sure people are being paid properly, making sure there's follow-up on, if what I've experienced has been something that is something that's happening regular, either from a specific person or from a specific area, maybe that's something that should be rectified. From a government perspective, maybe those sorts of business should be held more accountable for, that sort of thing. You can sort of see why people put up with or musicians put up with some of the issues that is inflicted on them. I mean, the one thing I think that was odd from a few people was me actually, I think, standing up for myself in both of these situations. Because, I mean, what repercussions you can have as an artist is when you do stand up for yourself, you do stand out. If you're saying this isn't appropriate, this is what needs to be done, this can, with such a small availability for work, that might rub someone else up the wrong way. And then suddenly that loses opportunity from there and that loses opportunity from there. Defending themselves might also
Cost them.
cause severe professional or financial losses and
exacerbate their existing issue, whether it's physical or mental health related.
Yeah. And I mean, in the last few years, there have been many artists who have lost their lives to mental health, which has been a fairly awful thing within the industry itself. And these are things which I think should perpetuate a quicker and a stronger response to change within the industry. Positive change doesn't happen overnight. Making as much of an impact as you can, or at least, looking from a broader perspective on that subject and looking on how much can you actually change this issue, or creating momentum behind this issue and getting more presence for it, and more positive presence, not just, we need to support mental health in musicians, like be more specific. Like how can we improve mental health in musicians? Do we improve the conditions? Do we improve the amount of venues that they can perform in? Do we set up education programs for emerging artists so they actually know how to avoid these situations?
You're a combination clearly of resilient and a very talented and hardworking professional musician. So where do you see the future for yourself, both as a musician and as a mental health advocate?
Mental health awareness is definitely something that needs to be tackled more proactively, in that I don't want to see other people targeted the same way I was. I think that's something I would like to see changed, either through educational ways, or even just the safety of, if someone has experienced this, they can feel comfortable to talk about it. They can feel comfortable to seek advice about it, or they can see that that's not right. I think that's how I see my work as a performer, and also, I guess, as an advocate within that space, as being quite relevant, in that one doesn't really exist without the other.
How do we follow you and your work both as a professional musician and advocate?
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to be performing quite regularly in different ways, and I've always got a wonderful opportunity to perform with lots of wonderful musicians. So if anyone wants to find out about my music, please feel free to Google and see what comes up.
Well, it's been a pleasure to chat with you, Elson. Good luck.
Thank you.